My name is Olivia Hart. My twin sister's name is Natalie. We are 31 years old. And for nearly our entire childhood, our family split us into two halves of a single person, as if between the two of us, there was only enough room for one complete set of qualities to go around. Natalie was the pretty one. I was the smart one. Those labels started so early that neither of us can remember a time before they existed, and by the time we were old enough to question them, they had already hardened into something that felt less like an opinion and more like a fact of biology, an assigned trait as fixed as our height or the color of our eyes. If you're new here, welcome. I tell true stories about families, the quiet ways they shape us, and the truths that sometimes take decades to surface. If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing. Now, let me take you back to where this began. Our mother, Diane, was the primary architect of this division, though I don't think she ever fully understood the damage it caused, at least not until much later. She was a woman who had grown up as one of 5 sisters herself, in a household where, according to family lore, comparisons between siblings were constant and unquestioned. She carried that pattern forward without much reflection, applying it to Natalie and me almost from infancy. I have photographs from when we were toddlers, and even in those early pictures, I can see the beginning of the split. Natalie in a frilly dress, hair carefully curled for the camera. Me in practical overalls, usually captured mid-motion, reaching for a book or a puzzle rather than posing. By the time we started kindergarten, the labels were fully in place, spoken openly, casually, the way families sometimes discuss traits they've decided are simply true. Natalie's our pretty one, my mother would tell new acquaintances, her hand resting on Natalie's shoulder. And Olivia's the smart one. She's going to do something important someday. I want you to notice something about those two labels, because it took me almost 3 decades to fully notice it myself. Pretty was treated as an inherent, effortless gift, something Natalie simply was, without needing to prove it through achievement. Smart was treated as a consolation prize, something I got because I apparently hadn't been given the other thing, and needed some other value to justify my existence in the family's eyes. Neither of us asked for these labels. Neither of us, especially at 5 or 6 years old, had the tools to reject them. We simply absorbed them, and built our entire identities, for years afterward, around living up to, or trying to escape, the roles we'd been assigned before we were old enough to have any say in the matter. Natalie's role came with its own quiet cruelty, one that took me years to fully appreciate, because from my position inside the smart label, I spent most of my childhood assuming Natalie had gotten the better deal. She was praised constantly for her appearance, her hair, her outfits, the way she smiled in photographs. But she was rarely, if ever, praised for anything else. When she brought home a good grade, our mother's response was polite but brief. When she brought home a mediocre grade, nobody seemed particularly concerned, because academic achievement had never been positioned as Natalie's domain to begin with. I remember being 9 years old, sitting beside Natalie as she worked through a homework assignment at the kitchen table, genuinely struggling with long division. Our mother walked by, glanced at Natalie's paper, and said, without any real malice, simply as an offhand observation, "That's okay, sweetie. Olivia can help you with that kind of thing. That's her specialty." At 9, I didn't understand what that sentence actually communicated to Natalie, that her academic effort, her genuine confusion and desire to understand something, wasn't worth taking seriously, because academic understanding simply wasn't supposed to be her thing. I only understood, in that moment, a flicker of pride that I had been called upon, that my label had been useful. It would take me another 2 decades to fully understand how much that constant deflection cost my sister. My role came with its own quiet cruelty too, one I felt much more directly, even as a child. Being the smart one meant that my achievements were expected rather than celebrated. When I brought home a perfect report card, my mother's response was matter-of-fact, almost bureaucratic, a brief, "Good job, Olivia," delivered with the same energy she might use to acknowledge that I'd remembered to take out the trash. It was simply what I was supposed to do, given my assigned role in the family. But when I showed any interest in my appearance, asking to get my hair styled a particular way, wanting a new dress for a school event, anything that fell into territory my mother had already designated as Natalie's domain, I was met with a different kind of response. Not outright discouragement, but a subtle, persistent redirection. I remember being 11, asking my mother if I could get my ears pierced, something several of my friends had already done. My mother's response has stayed with me clearly for 20 years. Olivia, that's really more Natalie's kind of thing. You've never been that interested in that stuff before. I hadn't been interested in it before, in part, because I had already absorbed, by 11 years old, that stuff belonged to Natalie's category, and that expressing interest in it would somehow be trespassing on territory that wasn't rightfully mine. If you've ever had an interest or a part of yourself quietly discouraged because it didn't fit the role your family had already assigned you, I understand exactly how confining that feels, even when nobody ever says the word no directly. Natalie and I, despite everything, remained close throughout our childhood, closer, I think, than many twins with more balanced treatment, precisely because we both understood, on some unspoken level, that we were each carrying half of a burden that should never have been split between us in the first place. We protected each other in small ways. I helped her with homework not because our mother assigned me to, but because I could see how much it wounded her to be told, implicitly, that trying to understand something was somehow beneath her assigned role. She, in turn, would sometimes help me get ready for school events, carefully doing my hair or picking out an outfit, gently insisting, in a way our mother never did, that I was allowed to care about how I looked too. By high school, the labels had calcified into something closer to prophecy. Natalie, despite being genuinely intelligent, I want to be absolutely clear about this, because it becomes central to what happens later in this story, increasingly disengaged from academics, internalizing years of subtle signals that her effort in that area wasn't particularly valued or expected. Her grades slipped, not because she lacked capability, but because she had spent a decade being told, in 100 small ways, that academic striving simply wasn't part of her assigned identity. I, meanwhile, threw myself entirely into academics, partly out of genuine interest, but partly, I now understand, out of a desperate need to justify my value within a family structure that had decided my worth was conditional on intellectual achievement, since I hadn't been granted the other currency my sister had been assigned. I avoided anything that might be perceived as vanity or interest in my appearance, not because I genuinely didn't care about those things, but because caring about them felt, somehow, like admitting defeat, like conceding that I had failed at the one role I'd been given. Natalie, for her part, leaned harder into her assigned role too, becoming genuinely skilled at things our family had always framed as her natural territory, fashion, style, and eye for aesthetics that, I'll admit now, went far beyond simple vanity. What I failed to appreciate for years was that this skill, this eye, actually represented a form of intelligence and creativity that our family simply never had the language to recognize as such, because it didn't fit into the narrow academic definition of a smart, that had been assigned to me instead. If you're watching this and you've ever watched a sibling struggle under the weight of a label just as confining as your own, even if it looked, from the outside, like the easier, or more desirable role, take a moment and like this video. These dynamics are rarely as simple as they appear from the outside. We both left for college, Natalie for a smaller state school, where she initially enrolled in a general studies program with no clear direction, and me for a more competitive university, on a partial academic scholarship, pursuing a degree in economics that I chose largely because it fit neatly into the identity I'd spent 18 years building. It was during our early 20s, largely independent of our family for the first time, that the actual shape of our respective talents finally had room to reveal itself, unfiltered by decades of assigned roles. Natalie, freed from a household that had never taken her intellectual curiosity seriously, discovered, almost by accident, a genuine passion for graphic design after taking an elective course in her second year of college. Her professor, reviewing an early project, told her directly that she had an unusually sophisticated eye for visual composition, a compliment that, Natalie later told me, she almost didn't know how to receive, having spent her entire life believing that eye for things only ever referred to fashion, never to anything requiring genuine intellectual rigor. She switched her major, graduated with honors, actual academic honors, the kind our family had always assumed belonged exclusively to me, and took an entry-level position at a design agency in Seattle, working her way up over the following years with a combination of talent and discipline that surprised absolutely everyone in our family except, quietly, me. I had always known Natalie was sharp. I had simply watched, for 18 years, as our family systematically discouraged her from believing it herself. I, meanwhile, discovered something during my early 20s that unsettled my own carefully constructed identity considerably more. During my sophomore year, largely on a whim, I took a photography elective to fulfill an arts requirement, expecting to check a box and move on with minimal effort. Instead, I found myself unexpectedly captivated, staying late in the darkroom, spending money I didn't really have on equipment, developing an interest that had nothing to do with economics, spreadsheets, or the identity I had spent nearly 2 decades building around being the smart one. I didn't tell my family about this interest for almost 2 years. I want to be honest about why. I was terrified, on some level I couldn't fully articulate at the time, that caring about something visual, something aesthetic, something that fell into territory my family had permanently assigned to Natalie, would somehow forfeit my only claim to value within our family structure. If I wasn't the smart one anymore, or if I revealed interests that complicated that identity, what, exactly, would I be? If you've ever hidden a genuine passion because it didn't fit the role your family had assigned you, I want you to know that fear is common, and it's also, almost always, unfounded. The people who truly know us can hold more than one truth about who we are. It was Natalie, during a visit to see me at school my junior year, who finally noticed the photography equipment scattered around my dorm room and asked, with genuine curiosity rather than judgment, what it was all about. I remember bracing myself for some version of the confusion or subtle discouragement I'd absorbed my whole childhood. Instead, Natalie's face lit up. "Olivia, these are incredible," she said, flipping through a stack of prints I'd been too nervous to show anyone. "You have a real eye for this. Why didn't you ever tell me you were doing this?" I remember sitting on my dorm room floor, 20 years old, finally telling my twin sister the truth I had never said out loud to anyone. Because I thought that was your thing. The visual stuff. I thought if I was good at it too, it would mean I wasn't actually the smart one, and then what would I even be to this family? Natalie was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that I think about often, even now, over a decade later. "Olivia, I spent our whole childhood thinking I wasn't allowed to be smart, because that was supposed to be your thing. Do you understand how insane that is? We're not two halves of one person. We're two separate people who both got told we could only have one trait each." That conversation, more than any single event in either of our lives, became the real turning point in how we understood our childhood, and eventually, how we approached the rest of our lives. We began, slowly, deliberately, to reject the labels we'd been assigned, not by abandoning the traits we'd developed. I remained genuinely interested in economics and analytical work, and Natalie remained genuinely gifted with visual design, but by refusing to let those traits define the boundaries of who we were allowed to become. I finished my economics degree, but I also continued developing my photography seriously, eventually building a second career as a commercial photographer alongside my analytical work, something that would have seemed impossible to imagine within the confines of my childhood identity. Natalie, alongside her design career, went back to school in her late 20s for an additional certification in market research, discovering a genuine talent for the kind of analytical thinking our family had always assumed was exclusively mine. We confronted our mother about this, eventually, during a visit home when we were both 28. It wasn't a dramatic, explosive confrontation. By that point, we had both done enough of our own healing, separately and together, that the conversation felt less like an accusation and more like a simple, overdue clarification. "Mom," Natalie said, during a quiet moment after dinner, "did you ever notice that you only ever complimented me on how I looked, and only ever complimented Olivia on her grades? For our entire childhood?" Our mother's face went through a familiar progression, surprise, then a flicker of defensiveness, then, finally, something closer to genuine reflection. "I don't think I meant it the way it sounds," she said slowly. I think I was just trying to make sure each of you had something that felt like yours. I didn't want you competing over the same things. But we didn't need separate categories to avoid competing, I said. We needed to be allowed to be whoever we actually were, even if that meant we overlapped sometimes. My mother didn't have a full response to that, not that day. But something did shift afterward, slowly, over the following years. She began, cautiously, to compliment Natalie's genuine intelligence, and to ask about my photography with real curiosity rather than the confused tolerance she had shown when I first mentioned it. It wasn't a complete transformation. Old patterns, especially ones a person has carried since their own childhood, rarely disappear entirely. But it was an acknowledgement, finally, that the labels she'd assigned us decades earlier had never actually captured either of us fully, and had cost both of us more than she'd ever intended. Natalie and I are closer now than we've ever been, not because we finally accepted the roles we were given, but because we finally rejected them together. She is, today, both genuinely brilliant and genuinely stylish, running her own design consultancy that draws on exactly the analytical rigor our family once insisted belonged only to me. I am, today, both genuinely analytical and genuinely creative, building a life that draws on skills our family once insisted belonged only to her. If you're watching this and you've ever been assigned a single defining trait by your family, told, implicitly or explicitly, that you could only be one thing, I want you to hear this clearly. You were never meant to be half of a whole. You were always allowed to be entirely, complicatedly yourself, and any label that told you otherwise was never actually about your limitations. It was about someone else's need for a simple story to tell. Thank you for watching this story all the way through. If it meant something to you, subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments if you've ever felt confined by a label your family assigned you as a child. Stories like ours matter, and sharing them helps them reach someone who needs to hear this today. I'll see you in the next story.